want to do a video today on the topic of hypoxic drive. The reason is that hypoxic drive theory is not true. I'm going to go into some of the misconceptions surrounding it. So let's start with a little bit of history. In 1949, there was a case study published where an old man was brought into a US emergency department with an exacerbation of his COPD. He was put on high-flow oxygen, and over the next hour he fell into a coma and he eventually died. And over the next several years, there were several more case studies published detailing this same chain of events. And doctors all around the world started scratching their heads, wondering what was going on. In 1967, a doctor called E.J.M. Campbell presented at a conference for pulmonologists his hypoxic drive theory. And we all know hypoxic drive theory. It goes that we're hypercarbic breathers, we rely on high carbon dioxide in our blood to trigger us to breathe. But since COPD patients who retain CO2 constantly have that high carbon dioxide, the brain, just getting tired of having that alarm bell ringing all day, switches to its hypoxic drive. Now, as a theory, it's great. It makes sense, it's easy to understand, and it's intuitive, but it's not true. What's absolutely not in dispute is that if you have a CO2 retaining COPD patient and you put them on high flow oxygen, their ventilations will steadily decrease. Their level of consciousness will decrease, and eventually they will become comatose and they may die. But hypoxic drive theory is not the cause of that. There are actually three reasons. Now, despite everything I've said, the first part of it is hypoxic drive, specifically the loss of hypoxic drive, but it is for everyone. I have a hypoxic drive. COPD patients have a hypoxic drive, and it forms a very small part of your respiratory drive. If I put an oxygen mask on myself, with oxygen going through it, my ventilation rate would very slightly decrease, and after about 15 minutes it would go back to normal. It's exactly the same with COPD patients, so there's clearly more to the story than that. A bigger effect is the Haldane effect. Now, the Haldane effect is complex, but in this setting it means that hemoglobin can hold a lot of oxygen or a lot of carbon dioxide, but it can't hold a lot of both, and it will preferentially bind to oxygen where it can. And this serves a valuable physiological purpose. In your body, when your hemoglobin are at your distal tissues, where metabolic processes are taking place, in a high carbon dioxide environment, they will scoop up all that CO2 and bring it back to the lungs. When they're in the oxygen-rich environment of the lungs, they will dump that carbon dioxide and carry on their way, and it works very well. But COPD patients can't gas exchange all that well. So they bring the carbon dioxide back to their lungs, attached to the hemoglobin, and they can't get rid of some of it. Because of this, the hemoglobin returned to the circulation still bound to CO2. And over time, this leads to a large buildup of CO2-bound hemoglobin. Now, the body can work with this as long as the system doesn't suddenly change. The body's very adaptable. But if you do change something, for example, if you give these patients high-flow oxygen, knowing that hemoglobin will preferentially bind to oxygen, the hemoglobin will detect all that available oxygen and they'll dump all that CO2 they're carrying into the blood. Now, if that happens over a short period, you'll have a rapid spike in arterial carbon dioxide, and via the Henderson reaction, an associated drop in the pH. But the Haldane effect is still not the whole story. VQ mismatching is the biggest problem for these patients. Now, VQ matching means that in a perfect world, whatever blood goes to your lungs, gas exchanges 100% and returns to your circulation full of oxygen with very little CO2. Anything that interferes with that is a VQ mismatch. So there can either be too little blood going to your lungs, or the blood that does go there is not able to gas exchange properly. Obviously, COPD patients have that existing VQ mismatch due to their structural damage. Now, your body's very clever. If I get a chest infection, say I get a lower lobe pneumonia, my body will recognize this and it'll vasoconstrict to those areas that aren't gas exchanging. It will shunt the blood elsewhere in my lungs where it can gas exchange properly. And then as I heal, as the gas exchange increases in that damaged area, the vasoconstriction will decrease and everything will return to normal. This happens diffusely and on a microscopic level for COPD patients due to their structural damage. But it relies on that hypoxic vasoconstriction. So your chemoreceptors in your pulmonary vasculature will vasoconstrict the blood vessels that lead to areas that aren't gas exchanging properly. And COPD patients rely on this to shunt blood to areas that are still gas exchanging so they can live. Now, if you suddenly give high flow oxygen to these patients, all those chemoreceptors are going to go, great, dark days are over. Now we have plenty of oxygen. And they're going to allow those vascular beds to open and have blood go through again to the areas of the lungs that still aren't gas exchanging. What this means is that the blood that goes in there is going to return to the circulation full of carbon dioxide with very little or no oxygen. This is again going to cause a rise in arterial CO2 and a drop in pH. Now all of this together is what causes the decrease in respirations, the altered level of consciousness, and the eventual coma or death that you can see in CO2 retainers. Now it's not all bad news. Not all COPD patients are CO2 retainers. It's hard to get concrete statistics on this because different health services have different measurements of what constitutes a retainer, but it's probably around 5 to 20% of COPD patients. A good rule of thumb is that you have a patient with SATs of 88 to 92%, you may be looking at a retainer. And you can simply ask them, as they will often know if they are or not. So why is hypoxic drive theory still taught? It's been known since 1989 that it's not true, but it's still taught today, and there's actually a pretty good reason for it. The explanation we've just been through is pretty complicated. Hypoxic drive theory is simple, and if you believe hypoxic drive theory, you will treat a COPD patient perfectly. You give them minimal O2, you won't let their CO2 get too high, and you won't overload them with oxygen. And that's why it's still taught. It's intuitive and easy to understand. You remember it. And at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter.